The police officer kept asking me the same question over and over. "Are you absolutely sure the man never left the road?" I nodded slowly, even though my hands were still shaking. "I'm telling you," I said. "He never moved." The officer exchanged a look with the other deputy standing behind him. Because according to them, the man I saw walking in the middle of that highway had already been dead for 3 days. And I'm the one who almost gave him a ride. It was late October when this happened, about 3 years ago. I was driving back home from visiting my older brother in western Pennsylvania. He lives out in a really rural area, one of those places where the nearest gas station is 20 minutes away and cell service barely works half the time. I had stayed longer than planned watching a football game with him and a few of his neighbors. By the time I finally got into my truck and started the engine, it was already close to midnight. The temperature had dropped fast that night, and fog had started rolling across the farmland like a thick gray blanket. I remember thinking I probably should have just stayed the night at his place. But I had work early the next morning and the drive home was only supposed to take about an hour, so I figured I'd be fine. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt completely normal. The road stretched out endlessly ahead of me, a long, empty 2-lane highway running through fields that looked black in the darkness. No houses, no streetlights, just my headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the fog. I had the radio on quietly just to keep myself awake, and every once in a while a patch of mist would drift across the road so thick that it almost swallowed the truck whole. But aside from that, there was nothing unusual about the drive. Eventually my GPS told me to turn onto a smaller county road that would supposedly save me 10 minutes. I slowed down and made the turn without thinking too much about it. Almost immediately the road felt different. The trees grew closer to the pavement, leaning inward like walls on both sides. The fog seemed heavier here too, like it had settled into the stretch of land and refused to move. The road narrowed enough that I had to keep my hands steady on the wheel just to stay centered between the faded yellow lines. I hadn't seen another car for at least 15 minutes. Not ahead of me, not behind me. Just silence and the quiet hum of the truck engine. Then I saw something standing in the middle of the road. At first it looked like nothing more than a dark shape. Just a silhouette caught in the edge of my headlights. I instinctively tapped the brake, leaning forward in my seat to see what it was. For a moment I actually wondered if it was a deer standing upright somehow or maybe a scarecrow blown loose from someone's field. But then the shape moved, 2 slow steps forward, and suddenly the headlights lit up a man walking directly down the center of the highway. I slammed the brakes harder than I needed to. The truck stopped maybe 20 feet away from him. The strange thing was that he didn't react at all. Most people would jump back or wave their arms or at least move to the side of the road. But this guy just kept walking slowly toward the front of my truck like he had expected me to stop there. I rolled my window down halfway and leaned my head out. "Hey!" I called out. "You okay out here?" The man stopped about 10 feet from the hood. For a few seconds he just stood there staring at me through the fog. The first thing I noticed was how pale he looked. Not pale like someone who hadn't slept in a while. More like the color had been drained completely from his skin. Almost gray. His clothes looked old too, like something from another decade. A heavy coat that hung loosely from his shoulders, worn boots covered in dirt, and a dark hat pulled low over his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded dry and rough, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "Can you give me a ride?" I hesitated before answering. Normally, I would never even consider letting a stranger into my truck in the middle of nowhere. But the guy looked cold and the nearest town had to be miles away. "Where you headed?" I asked. He lifted his arm slowly and pointed behind my truck. "Just up the road." That answer made my stomach tighten immediately. Behind my truck was the direction I had just come from. Miles of empty farmland with nothing but woods and dirt roads. "Your car break down or something?" I asked. He nodded once. "Up there." Again he pointed behind me into the fog. Something about the way he answered felt off, like he wasn't really thinking about the words he was saying. His eyes didn't blink. He didn't step closer to the passenger door. And the fog behind him seemed to swirl strangely in the light. That's when I noticed something else that made my chest feel tight. There were no footprints behind him on the wet pavement. The road had been damp from rain earlier that evening. I knew from experience that even walking a few steps would leave clear prints in conditions like that. But the pavement behind him looked untouched, smooth and empty, like no one had been there at all. "Your car's still back there?" I asked carefully. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step closer to the passenger side of my truck. Close enough now that I could finally see his face clearly. And that's when I noticed the blood. It had dried along the side of his forehead and down his cheek. Dark streaks that looked hours old. Maybe older. My heart started pounding. "Hey man," I said quickly. "Are you hurt?" He stared at me for another few seconds before slowly smiling. It wasn't a normal smile. His mouth stretched wide in a way that looked forced, unnatural. Then he spoke again. "I've been trying to get home for a long time. Something in my gut told me to leave immediately." "Sorry," I said as I began rolling the window up. "I can call someone for you though." The moment the glass started moving upward, his expression changed instantly. The smile vanished. His eyes widened. Suddenly he slammed both hands against the side of my truck with a loud bang that made me jump in my seat. "Don't leave," he shouted. I didn't think about it for another second. I hit the gas. The truck lunged forward, forcing him to jump out of the way. As I passed him, I caught a quick glimpse of him standing motionless again in the middle of the road, watching me disappear into the fog. I drove faster than I probably should have for the next mile, checking my mirrors over and over again. But the road behind me stayed empty. Eventually, my phone caught enough signal to call the police. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a small county sheriff's office explaining everything that had happened. 2 deputies listened carefully while I described the man, the road, and the strange way he appeared out of nowhere. When I finished, one of them asked a simple question. "Did he say where he came from?" I told them the truth. Just that he was trying to get home. The deputy leaned back slowly in his chair. Then he pulled out his phone and turned it toward me. The photo on the screen showed a man wearing the same hat and coat I had seen on the road. My stomach dropped instantly. "That's him," I said. The deputy nodded quietly. Then he zoomed out on the image, revealing the headline of a news article above the photo. "Local man found dead after highway accident." The date of the article was 3 days earlier. According to the report, his truck had crashed into a tree about 2 miles from the exact road where I said I saw him walking. I stared at the phone screen, trying to make sense of what I was reading. "But he talked to me," I said. "He asked me for a ride." The deputy looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You're not the first person who's told us that." The first thing the state trooper asked me was a question I still can't answer. "Why did you stop your truck if you knew someone was already inside the trailer?" I didn't know how to respond to that, because when I heard the knocking, I was absolutely certain the trailer behind me was empty. And that's what makes the whole thing worse. Because if someone was in there the entire time, then they had been riding with me for almost 2 hours. I've been driving long-haul routes for most of my adult life. I'm 58 now, and at the time this happened, I had been on the road for almost 30 years. You get used to a certain rhythm out there. Empty highways, gas stations at 2 a.m., the quiet hum of tires on asphalt. Most nights are completely uneventful. But the run I was on that night was different. I was hauling an empty refrigerated trailer from Missouri up toward Iowa to pick up a load the next morning. Empty trailers are a little easier to drive because they're lighter, but they also rattle more. The metal panels shift slightly with the wind and the road vibration. So when I heard the first noise, I didn't think anything of it. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I left the last truck stop. The roads were nearly empty. I remember the sky was perfectly clear and the moon was bright enough to illuminate the fields on both sides of the highway. About 30 minutes into the drive, I heard a dull thump from somewhere behind me. Just one. It sounded like something sliding inside the trailer. I glanced at my mirrors, but everything looked normal. No lights, no vehicles following too close. The trailer doors were still locked. Empty trailers sometimes make odd noises when they hit bumps, so I ignored it and kept driving. 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time it was louder. Thump. Then a dragging sound across the floor of the trailer. That made me frown. I remember thinking maybe a loose strap or chain had been left inside when the last load was unloaded. It wouldn't be the first time something like that happened. Still, the sound was strange enough that I turned the radio down and listened more carefully. For the next 15 minutes, the road stayed quiet. No noises. Nothing unusual. Just the steady roar of the engine and the wind pushing against the cab. Then the knocking started. 3 slow taps. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up straighter in my seat, because that didn't sound like something sliding around. That sounded deliberate. I checked my mirrors again. Still nothing. The trailer behind me looked completely normal. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. Exactly the same rhythm. Like someone knocking on a door. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I tried to reason it out in my head. Maybe the metal walls were flexing with the wind. Maybe a loose hook was bouncing against the side. But deep down I knew those explanations didn't make sense. Metal doesn't knock in perfect rhythm. People do. The next rest area was about 5 miles ahead. So I decided I'd pull over and check the trailer just to clear my mind. The highway was still empty as I exited onto the small gravel lot. It was one of those roadside pull-offs meant for truckers to rest for a few minutes. No building. No lights except the faint glow from the highway behind it. I parked near the far edge of the lot and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was almost unsettling. For a few seconds I just sat there listening. Nothing. No movement. No knocking. Part of me felt silly for even stopping. But another part of me knew I wouldn't relax until I checked. So I grabbed my flashlight from the passenger seat and stepped down from the cab. The cold night air hit me immediately. I walked slowly along the side of the trailer toward the back doors. My boots crunched against the gravel with every step. The flashlight beam bounced across the metal panels of the trailer, reflecting back at me in dull flashes. Everything looked completely normal. When I reached the rear doors, I noticed the security seal was still intact. That meant nobody had opened the trailer since it was last locked, which should have been impossible if someone was inside. Still, my hands felt tense as I unlocked the latch and pulled the heavy door open. The flashlight beam cut into the dark interior of the trailer. It was empty, completely empty. Bare metal floor, bare walls, nothing inside. I stood there for a moment feeling slightly embarrassed. Maybe the noise really had been just the trailer shifting. I closed the door again and secured the latch. As I turned to walk back to the truck, that's when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time it didn't come from inside the trailer. It came from directly behind me. I spun around so fast the flashlight beam shook wildly across the gravel. There was nothing there. Just the empty road behind the rest stop and the fields stretching out into darkness. My heart was pounding now. I walked quickly back to the cab, climbed inside, and locked the doors. For a moment I just sat there breathing heavily. Maybe I was just tired. Truckers don't always get the best sleep on the road. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. For the next 30 minutes the drive stayed quiet again. I was just starting to calm down when something moved in my side mirror. At first I thought it was another vehicle approaching. But the headlights never appeared. Instead I saw something else. The rear door of the trailer. It was slowly swinging open. My stomach dropped. I knew I had closed it. I knew the latch was secure. But in the mirror the door creaked wider and wider as the truck rolled forward. I immediately slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder. When I climbed down from the cab this time, my legs felt weak. The trailer door was fully open now, hanging slightly crooked in the wind. I walked back toward it carefully. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I raised it toward the dark interior again. The trailer still looked empty, but the floor was different. There were footprints now. Dirty footprints. They started near the very front of the trailer, and they led directly toward the open door. My chest tightened, because there had been no footprints earlier, which meant one thing. Someone had been inside the trailer after I checked it, and they had just gotten out. Right behind me. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps running through the grass beside the highway. I turned just in time to see a figure disappearing into the darkness of the fields. I never saw the person clearly, just a tall shape sprinting away into the night. When the state troopers arrived 20 minutes later, they searched the fields for almost an hour. They never found anyone. But they did find something else about 100 yards away. A backpack. Inside it were several tools, bolt cutters, crowbar, and duct tape. The trooper who showed it to me asked the question I still think about sometimes. What do you think he was planning to do once you stopped for the night? I didn't have an answer. And honestly, I'm glad I never found out. The detective told me later that if I had stayed in the house for even 5 more minutes, they probably wouldn't have found me alive. At the time, though, I didn't realize how serious the situation was. All I knew was that someone was knocking on my door at 3:17 in the morning, and they were whispering my name. The strange thing was, I had never told anyone in that town my name. I had only been living there for 3 days. About a year ago, I decided to move out of the city after I retired. I had spent nearly 40 years working as an electrician in Chicago, and by the time I turned 60, I was tired of noise, traffic, and crowded streets. I wanted somewhere quiet where I could fish, take long walks, and actually sleep with the windows open. A friend of mine told me about a small town in northern Michigan where property was still affordable. It had 1 gas station, 1 diner, and more forest than people. Exactly the kind of place I had been looking for. I found a small cabin for sale just outside town, about 15 minutes down a narrow gravel road surrounded by dense woods. The place wasn't fancy, but it was solid. 1 floor, wooden porch, and a small lake about half a mile away. The first 2 nights there were peaceful. Too peaceful, honestly. The woods out there were so quiet at night that sometimes I could hear my own heartbeat when I lay in bed. On the 3rd night, I went to sleep around 11 after unpacking a few boxes and watching an old movie. The air outside was cool and the forest smelled like pine through the open windows. At some point during the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The room was completely dark except for the faint glow of moonlight through the curtains. Then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft taps on the front door. I rolled over and looked at the clock beside my bed. 3:17 a.m. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined it. Old houses make noises sometimes, especially when the temperature drops at night. But then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate. My stomach tightened immediately. Nobody visits someone's house at 3 in the morning in a place like that. I sat up slowly, listening carefully. The cabin was completely silent except for the faint sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Then I heard something else. A voice, barely louder than a whisper. Daniel! The sound froze me in place, because that was my name. And like I said before, I hadn't told anyone in that town my name yet. I had only met the real estate agent and the clerk at the gas station. Neither of them even knew where exactly my cabin was. I sat there for a full minute trying to convince myself I was still half asleep. But then the voice came again. Daniel, open the door. It was soft, almost gentle, but something about the tone made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like someone asking for help. It sounded like someone pretending to be calm. I slowly slid out of bed and walked toward the living room, keeping my footsteps as quiet as possible. The knocking had stopped now, but I could hear something moving outside on the porch. Slow footsteps across the wooden boards. The cabin didn't have a peephole in the door, but there was a narrow window beside it with thin curtains covering the glass. I stood beside the wall and carefully pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. The porch light was off, but the moon provided enough light for me to see the shape standing there. A man, tall, facing the door. He wasn't moving, just standing there, waiting. I couldn't see his face clearly because the brim of his hat cast a shadow across it. But something about the way he stood there felt wrong. Too still, too patient. Then his head slowly turned toward the window. Even though I knew he couldn't see me through the curtain, I stepped back immediately. My heart was pounding in my chest. The voice came again, this time louder. Daniel, I know you're awake. Every instinct in my body told me not to respond. I stayed completely silent. After a few seconds, the man knocked again. Knock, knock, knock. Then something even stranger happened. Another voice spoke. from somewhere farther away in the woods. Did he answer? The man on the porch didn't respond. But I heard footsteps moving across the gravel driveway. More than one set. My chest tightened as realization hit me. There wasn't just one person outside. There were several. I quietly backed away from the door and moved toward the kitchen where my phone was charging. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered quickly, and I whispered what was happening. While I was explaining the situation, I heard the doorknob slowly turn. The door rattled slightly as someone tested the lock. Then one of the voices outside spoke again. "He's inside." Another voice replied, "Break it." That was enough for me. I grabbed my truck keys from the counter and ran toward the back door of the cabin. The rear exit opened onto a small deck that led down into the woods. I didn't even bother turning on a light. I just ran. Branches snapped under my feet as I moved through the trees behind the cabin. I could hear shouting coming from the direction of the house. Then the sound of the front door being forced open. I didn't stop running until I reached the gravel road nearly 200 yards away. From there, I kept moving until I saw headlights approaching in the distance. It was a sheriff's cruiser. The officers searched the area around the cabin for hours. By the time they arrived, whoever had been there was gone. But they did find something strange. Just off the edge of the driveway, hidden near the tree line, there was an old wooden sign partially buried in the dirt. It looked like it had once marked the property years ago. The lettering had faded, but you could still read it. Beneath the name of the previous owner were several other names carved into the wood. 6 of them, each with a date beside it. The last name on the list was carved only 2 weeks before I bought the cabin. When the detective showed it to me later, he pointed to the empty space beneath the final name. Then he said something that still bothers me whenever I think about that night. "You were probably supposed to be the next one."